He fixed the Queen's vessel during a crisis. The alien court interpreted it as a formal union proposal. The distress signal was not designed for human ears. It arrived on a frequency that the ISV Ardent Resolve, a mid-tonnage repair and recovery vessel assigned to the outer Kepler corridor, had no formal protocol for receiving. Chief Engineer Marcus Vale heard it first as interference. A rhythmic, low-frequency pulse that kept interrupting the ship's passive sensor sweep like a rock thrown into still water. He flagged it. That was all. He flagged it and sent it up the chain. Commander Priya Suresh was eating her third meal of the day when the notification reached her console. She was not a woman prone to alarm. 12 years in the Interstellar Recovery Corps had given her a particular kind of patience. The kind that comes from watching things break and then watching people fix them over and over, until the breaking and the fixing become equally unremarkable. She looked at the waveform on her screen for a long moment. Then she looked at it again. "Vale," she said over shipwide, "how long has this been coming in?" 47 minutes, Commander. I flagged it at first contact. Why didn't you escalate? I wasn't sure it was anything, he said. Pause. Now I'm sure it's something. She pulled up the navigational overlay. Neutral space. The outer buffer corridor between human claimed territory and the region informally acknowledged, through silence mostly, as belonging to the Vakarath Collective. 3 years of tense non-communication had produced something that wasn't peace and wasn't war. It was closer to two large animals each pretending the other didn't exist. The source of the signal was approximately 11,000 kilometers off their current bearing. Long-range optics brought the image in slowly, pixel by pixel, resolving into a shape that Suresh had seen in classified briefings but never in open space. A Vakarath vessel. Long, curved, built along lines that reminded human engineers of deep-sea creatures. Ribs of structural metal forming a hull that looked almost organic. It was a Queen-class diplomatic carrier, roughly twice the size of the Ardent Resolve, and it was not moving. It was not moving and parts of it were venting. Suresh understood the tactical situation immediately. If she transmitted to Earth coordination, she would be told to hold position and await instructions. Instructions that could take 6 to 9 hours to arrive given current relay distances. If she moved away, she was abandoning a vessel in distress. A vessel crewed by beings she had never spoken to but whose civilization had, by most intelligence estimates, the capability to end the outer colonies if they decided humans were no longer worth tolerating. If she moved closer, she was crossing an implicit line. She sat with that for approximately 4 seconds. Vale, she said. What would you need to make an approach? He didn't hesitate. Permission. You have it. What else? 2 hours. A mobility pod. My kit. The Ardent Resolve was not a warship. It carried no offensive armament beyond emergency deterrence. What it carried was Marcus Vale, a man with 17 years of deep systems engineering experience, a memory that cataloged mechanical failure like a library, and a philosophically unusual belief that the function of a machine was to work, and that it was a kind of moral failure to leave a machine broken when you had the tools to fix it. He didn't think in terms of politics. He thought in terms of the problem in front of him. The problem in front of him was a ship that was dying. Suresh filed a full disclosure report to Earth coordination, tagged it urgent, and noted the timestamp. Then she authorized Vale's approach. Whatever was going to happen in the next few hours, she wanted it on record that humanity had not hesitated, had not calculated advantage, had simply seen a vessel in distress and moved toward it. That detail would matter later, though neither of them knew it yet. The mobility pod was a small, pressurized craft built for exactly this kind of work. External repairs, docking maneuvers in unstable conditions, personnel transfer between vessels and environments where standard docking was impossible. Vale loaded it with a specific toolkit, said nothing dramatic and launched. The Vakarath vessel grew in his forward viewport as he crossed the distance. Up close, the damage was more apparent. Something had ruptured in the ship's core drive assembly, the central column that, based on every human analysis of Vakarath propulsion theory, regulated the energy distribution across the vessel's biological synthetic hybrid systems. Without it, the ship was a sealed environment slowly losing coherence. Atmospheric pressure systems, temperature regulation, emergency power, all of it was degrading, slowly but measurably, in a cascade that engineers recognize immediately. When one system fails, it draws on others which then fail, which draws on more. A ship dying of its own weight. Vale matched velocity with the drifting hull and found a maintenance access point that he recognized from classified schematics. He had studied those schematics once 2 years ago, in a 6-hour briefing that he had largely slept through. He was glad now that his hands had more memory than his conscious mind. He made contact with the hull. Inside the Vakarath vessel, every sensor in the damaged system registered the contact simultaneously. And in the command chamber, surrounded by her court, a word that translated imperfectly into human languages but captured something of the combination of advisors, guardians, and witnesses who surrounded a Vakarath queen designate at all times. Etherivel felt the vibration through the hull. Something small had just landed on her dying ship. Something human. Her court had no consensus. Her systems had no protocol. Her vessel had perhaps 8 hours of survivable atmosphere remaining. She authorized internal sensors to track the small human's movements, and she waited. What Marcus Vale did over the next 2 hours would be analyzed by Vakarath scholars for the next 3 decades. Not because it was dramatic. Not because it was heroic in any conventional sense. Because it worked. There is a specific kind of focus that descends on engineers in a crisis. It is not heroism. It is closer to the opposite of heroism, a narrowing of attention so complete that the larger situation simply ceases to register. The fear, the politics, the awareness that one wrong move might constitute an act of war. All of it compresses down to the thing in front of you, the component in your hands, the reading on your diagnostic tool. Marcus Vale had entered this state approximately 40 seconds after attaching his mobility pod to the outer hull of the Vakarath Queen carrier Luminous Persistence. He did not know the ship's name. He would learn it later. What he knew, working his way through a maintenance access corridor that was narrower than standard human design and lined with structural material that his equipment identified as a titanium ceramic composite with biological polymer threading, which he filed mentally under interesting deal with later, was that the cascade failure he'd observed from outside was centered in the vessel's primary regulation column. The column itself was not entirely unlike human deep drive regulators. Different in specifics, radically different in materials science, but mechanically recognizable in principle. Energy conversion required control. Control required a stable reference point. The stable reference point had failed. He spent the first 40 minutes locating exactly what had failed. It was a pressure fracture in the primary load-bearing junction, a join between two materials with different thermal expansion rates that had, under some stress event he could only theorize about, developed a microfracture that had then propagated under load until the junction separated. The vessel's automatic repair systems had attempted to compensate, which had made things worse in the specific way that automated systems sometimes make things worse, confidently at scale. Vale did something that would later become significant in Vakarath cultural discussions about humanity. He turned off the automatic repair systems. Not because he didn't trust them. Because he needed the ship to stop trying to fix itself while he was fixing it. Competing inputs to a damaged system compound the problem. The Vakarath court watched this on internal sensors. The human had accessed their engineering subsystems. Had deliberately disabled their automated response protocols. Was now moving with what their behavioral analysis systems characterized as deliberate non-reactive motion. In human terms, this meant Vale was working carefully without hurry. To the Vakarath it read differently. In their culture, the act of quieting another's defensive systems was profoundly intimate. It was something done between trusted parties in moments of vulnerability. Mothers did it to children. Partners did it to partners. Healers did it to patients. This was not a reading that any human diplomat would have anticipated. Vale, unaware, continued working. The fracture required a bridging compound, something that could bond across the two materials and accommodate their different expansion rates. His standard repair kit contained several options. None of them were designed for Vakarath materials. He ran his analyzer across the junction and looked at the results and then looked at his kit and made a decision that was practical rather than inspired. The closest thermal tolerance match he had was a silicon carbide bonding compound designed for human deep drive regulators operating in high-variance thermal environments. It wasn't the right compound, but it would hold. More importantly, it would hold long enough for the cascade to stabilize, for the ship's own systems to re-engage under controlled conditions, and for the vessel to recover atmospheric integrity. He applied it. He had brought microfilament reinforcement wire, thin as hair, stronger than most structural metals, and he ran it through the junction in 3 passes, creating a mechanical brace that would hold the bonding compound in place during the curing cycle. His hands moved in the particular, unhurried way of someone who has done this kind of work for years. No wasted motion, no drama, just the steady accumulation of correct actions. 40 minutes of work. 12 minutes of curing time. He sat in the maintenance corridor and ate a nutrition bar while the compound set, his helmet lights illuminating a section of alien hull material that no human had ever been close enough to touch. He noticed, while he waited, that the structural polymer threading in the walls was not entirely inert. It had a faint bioluminescence, barely detectable but real. He filed this under interesting deal with later. When the curing cycle completed, he re-engaged the Vakarrath automated systems selectively, primary regulation first, then thermal management, then atmospheric. He watched the readings climb. Pressure stabilizing. Temperature normalizing. The cascade's progression slowing, arresting, reversing. He re-engaged the final system, the one that controlled the hull's external heat dissipation, and felt the faint vibration of a ship's systems returning to life beneath his hands. Then he did one more thing. He collected a small sample of the fractured junction material, packaged it in an evidence container, and wrote a short technical summary of what he'd found and what he'd done, including exact compound and material specifications, and attached it to the exterior of the maintenance access point he'd entered through. Not for the Vakarrath. For whoever came next, human or otherwise, if this repair ever needed to be reviewed or repeated. He was thorough. It was simply what he did. In the command chamber, Etherevel felt her ship breathe again. The atmospheric readings climbed through the survival threshold. The cascade failure indicators dropped from red to amber to yellow to the pale gold of stable but monitored. Her court was silent around her. She had seen the human's actions on sensor replay. Had seen every choice he made. Had seen him silence her ship's defensive reflex, work with focused patience for over an hour, apply a compound from his own supply without any expectation of reciprocity, and then leave documentation for whoever might follow. Her chief advisor, Terrell Shu, made the formal observational statement that protocol required. The vessel is stable. The crisis has passed. The agent of repair has acted. The specific phrasing of that last sentence, in the original Vakarrath, carried an implication that would not survive direct translation into most human languages. In Vakarrath, there was no neutral word for someone who entered your vulnerability, quieted your defenses, and healed what was broken. That act had a name. That act had a status. That act had, in every Vakarrath legal and cultural precedent for the past 600 years, a very specific meaning. Etherevel looked at the sensor image of the small human re-entering his mobility pod and beginning the transit back to his own vessel. She said something to her court that her translators would days later render approximately as, "He has made his intention known." Her court did not dispute this. Outside, in the cold of neutral space, Marcus Vale didn't know any of this. He was thinking about the nutrition bar he'd eaten and whether the ship's galley would have anything better for dinner. The repair had gone clean. The work was done. He filed a brief incident report from the pod, marked the mission status as complete, no further action required, and piloted back toward the Ardent Resolve. In the Vakarrath command chamber, a formal notation was entered into the ship's official record. The word used in that notation had no human equivalent. The closest translation, which historians would argue about for years, was something like, proposal made, witnessed, recorded. 48 hours of silence is not unusual in first contact scenarios. Every xenodiplomacy protocol developed by the Earth Coordination Authority acknowledged this. Silence could mean deliberation, communication delay, internal disagreement, cultural processing time, or simply the logistical challenge of translating between parties who shared no common language and no common context. Commander Priya Suresh knew all of this. She had read the protocols. She had sat through the briefings. She understood intellectually that 48 hours was not alarming. She was still alarmed. The Ardent Resolve had held position at a respectful distance from the luminous persistence since Vale returned. The Vakarrath vessel had stabilized, their sensors confirmed this, and had not moved. It had also not responded to any of the standard first contact communication packages that Suresh had transmitted, cautiously at 6-hour intervals. Not rejection, not acknowledgement. Silence. Earth Coordination had received her report. The response had arrived in layered stages that she recognized as bureaucratic triage. First an acknowledgement, then a holding instruction, then a task force notification, then after 18 hours, the arrival on encrypted channel of a diplomatic liaison officer named Dr. Emeka Osei, who transmitted his credentials from a relay station 4 light hours away and informed Suresh that he was being physically dispatched to her location. ETA? She asked. 60 hours, Osei said. His voice was steady and carefully neutral in the way of people trained to be steady and carefully neutral. Do not initiate further communication. Do not alter your position. Do not, and I want to be specific here, allow Engineer Vale to board that vessel again. He repaired their ship. I am aware of what he did, Commander. That is precisely why I'm asking you to ensure he stays where he is. There was something in Osei's tone that Suresh parsed carefully. It wasn't exactly alarm. It was the particular tightness of someone who had looked at a situation and identified dimensions to it that the people in the middle of it hadn't yet seen. She told Vale. He shrugged. The repair's done, he said. There's nothing left to fix. That's not the concern. What's the concern? Suresh paused. I'm not entirely sure. But someone in xenodiplomacy is concerned. Vale poured himself coffee and returned to his technical workbench, where he was reviewing the material sample he'd collected from the Vakarath hull. He had been examining it for the better part of a day. The biological polymer threading was extraordinary, a hybridized material that combined structural integrity with low-level energy conduction in a way that human materials science had theorized but never achieved. He was not thinking about diplomacy. He was thinking about the material. This was, in some ways, the essence of the problem. Meanwhile, on the luminous persistence, the situation was anything but silent. Etherivel was presiding over an extended formal session of her court, a proceeding that had been in continuous session since the moment Vale departed. The Vakarath court was not an advisory body in the way humans used the word. It was simultaneously a legal institution, a cultural archive, and a witness body whose formal observations had binding weight in diplomatic and civil law. When her court convened in formal session, what happened there was recorded and legally actionable. The session had two primary matters. The first was technical, the repair itself. 3 members of her engineering cadre had reviewed every sensor record of Vale's work. Their assessment was thorough. He had correctly identified the failure mechanism, had correctly understood, largely by inference working from first principles with tools not designed for their systems, what was needed to arrest the cascade, had applied a repair that was technically imperfect but functionally adequate, had critically documented everything. The engineering cadre's formal assessment was competent, methodical, effective. The second matter was cultural and legal, and it was considerably more complex. Terrell Shu, who held the court position most closely analogous to a chief legal advisor, had prepared a formal analysis. He presented it in the Vakarath tradition of legal discourse, without emotion, without emphasis, with scrupulous attention to precedent. The analysis was, in summary, this. The human male had accessed the luminous persistence during a period of crisis and vulnerability. He had, without instruction or guidance, silenced the vessel's defensive automated responses, an act that, in Vakarath precedent, required a level of trust or presumed relationship that did not yet exist between these parties. He had then performed an act of sustained, skilled, patient care that had preserved the vessel and everyone aboard it. He had done this using his own materials at personal risk in neutral space, with no stated compensation requirement. He had then documented his work for future reference. Each of these elements, taken individually, could be explained as pragmatic behavior. An engineer doing his job. Taken together, in the cultural and legal framework that governed Vakarath court proceedings, they formed a pattern with a specific name. Terrell Shu used that name. He cited 600 years of precedent. He noted that the witnessing requirement had been satisfied. The ship's internal sensors constituted a valid witness record. He noted that the voluntary nature of the act was unambiguous. He then stated formally for the court record, in the judgment of this court and per precedent, a formal petition of union has been made and recorded. The court did not dispute this. Etherivel listened to all of it. She was not a sentimental being. The Queen-designate title was a political and administrative role as much as a cultural one, and she had occupied it for 11 years through a process that required intelligence, patience, and considerable political acuity. She was also, by the standards of her people, young. She thought about the sensor recording she had reviewed 17 times. The human in the maintenance corridor. Eating something from a small package. Waiting with complete patience for a compound to cure. She issued her formal response to the court's finding. It was not a rejection. Vakarath law was complex on the matter of formal petitions. Rejection had specific conditions, specific language, specific procedures. Simply doing nothing was itself a legally meaningful act. Etherivel chose, after 11 minutes of silence that her court recorded carefully, to do nothing. In the human diplomatic tradition, that might have read as indifference. In Vakarath law it was something else entirely. When the Vakarath transmission finally arrived at the Ardent Resolve, exactly 49 hours and 12 minutes after Vale's return, it was not addressed to Commander Suresh. It was not addressed to Earth Coordination. It was addressed, specifically and by individual identifier derived from his suit's biosignature transponder, to Chief Engineer Marcus Vale. The message was brief. It contained a formal greeting protocol, a statement of health of the luminous persistence and all aboard, and a phrase that the ship's translation matrix rendered, after a 30-second processing delay, as, "The petition is acknowledged. The court awaits response." Suresh read the translation. She read it again. She transmitted it to Osei at the relay station. His response arrived in 4 minutes, which meant he had been watching and was ready. "Don't show Vale that message," he said. "He has a right to his mail," Suresh said. Pause. "Commander. I need you to understand that whatever you think happened over there, the Vakarath court has just formally initiated a proceeding under their most significant body of civil law. Until I arrive and we understand exactly what their translation means, I need Engineer Vale to not respond." "What body of law?" she asked. Osei told her. She went and found Vale in his workbench area. He was still examining the material sample. She sat across from him and looked at him for a moment. "What?" he said. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Fine," he said. "Why?" She decided to tell him. Whatever Osei said, the man had a right to know. She told him. Vale looked at her for a very long time. Then he looked at his material sample. Then he said, in the tone of a man running a diagnostic on something unexpected, That's not what I was doing." "I know," Suresh said. "I was fixing a ship." "I know. I didn't propose to anyone." "I believe you," she said carefully. "The question is whether they do." Dr. Emeka Osei arrived aboard the Ardent Resolve 62 hours after his initial transmission, 2 hours behind schedule due to a navigational adjustment he declined to explain. He was a compact man in his mid-50s, with the kind of face that revealed almost nothing and the kind of eyes that were cataloging everything. He shook Suresh's hand, nodded to the assembled crew, and asked immediately to speak with Vale. The meeting took place in the ship's small conference room, which served double duty as the medical officer's briefing space and smelled faintly of antiseptic. Osei set a recording device on the table, stated the time, date, and parties present, and then looked at Vale with the direct attention of someone who had prepared extensively for this conversation. "I need to understand exactly what you did," Osei said. "Not the repair. I have the technical report. I need to understand the sequence of decisions." Vale walked him through it. He was precise. He described the access corridor, the fracture identification, the decision to disable automated repair systems, the choice of bonding compound, the reinforcement wire, the documentation he'd left on the hull exterior. Osei listened without interruption. He took no notes, he was clearly relying on the recording. When Vale finished, Osei was quiet for a moment. "The decision to disable their automated systems," he said. "You didn't hesitate?" "It was the obvious call," Vale said. "If their automated systems were trying to compensate during the repair, I'd be working against them. You can't repair a wound while the body's immune response is actively fighting you." "How did you know it was safe to do that?" "I didn't know it was safe. I knew it was necessary." Osei nodded slowly. "And the documentation you left on the hull?" "Standard practice. If someone needs to revisit the repair or if something fails at the junction in the future, they need to know what compound is there and what the failure mode was." "You left that for them." "I left it for whoever," Vale said. "Human repair crew, Vakarath engineer, whoever. It's just, you document your work. That's what you do." Another silence. Osei picked up a tablet from the table and turned it so Vale could see. It showed a schematic of the Vakarath Queen Designate protocol, a diagram of roles and relationships around the Queen Designate position that Earth's Xenodiplomacy Division had assembled from intercepted cultural data over the past 3 years. "The Queen Designate of the Vakarath Collective is not simply a political title," Osei said. "It has a civil dimension. The collective operates on a social structure in which the Queen Designate's court functions as a legal institution. Their civil law, particularly around formal relationships, is administered through the court, with the court's recorded observations serving as legally binding testimony." Vale looked at the schematic. "All right. In their legal tradition, acts of care performed for a Queen Designate during a period of vulnerability, performed voluntarily with demonstrated competence at personal risk without stated compensation, have a specific legal classification. There is no exact translation. The closest we have is something like formal petition of committed partnership. It is the highest order civil petition in their legal system. It is filed, under their law, not through words or formal declaration but through action." Vale was quiet. "You," Osei said carefully, "according to the court's formal finding, have filed such a petition." "I fixed a ship," Vale said. "I was doing my job." "In your cultural context, yes. In theirs, and the legal weight is in theirs because it happened on their vessel, under their court's observation. The actions constituted a filing. That's not, I wasn't, Vale stopped. What does that mean? Practically. What does it actually mean? Osei set the tablet down. That depends in large part on what happens next. The Queen-designate has acknowledged the petition. Her court is formally awaiting response. There are 3 possible outcomes under their law. He held up 3 fingers. Formal acceptance, which has significant civil and political implications. Formal rejection, which requires specific language and specific process, and which carries its own diplomatic weight. A rejection of a valid petition is not a neutral act. It has legal consequences for the relationship between the petitioning party and the court. Or, he paused, the petition can be acknowledged without resolution, held in a pending state, which is itself a legal position. She chose the third option, Suresh said from the doorway. Osei glanced at her. He had not invited her to this meeting. She met his look evenly. He has a right to the full picture. A beat passed between the 2 senior officers, and then Osei gave a small nod. She chose the third option. Yes. Vale looked at the table. He was a precise man and he was visibly trying to apply precision to something that resisted it. So she hasn't accepted it. But she hasn't rejected it either. That's correct. And if I don't respond at all? You have already responded by not rejecting it. The petition's transmission to you, followed by your silence, has been recorded by their court. In their framework, silence from a petitioner following acknowledgement is read as, Osei searched for the right phrase, continued openness. It's not acceptance. But it's not refusal. I've been accidentally courting an alien queen for 3 days, Vale said. It was not quite a question. The cultural framing is different enough that I'd caution against. That's what happened, Vale said. In functional terms. I did things that, in their cultural system, read as a formal proposal. She's waiting to see what I do next. And every day I don't explicitly reject it, He stopped. What does explicit rejection look like? Osei reached for the tablet again. That's what I need to discuss with you. Because explicit rejection, under their law, is not simply declining. It carries the legal weight of a formal disavowal of relationship. It signals not just, this petition is not accepted, but, the party petitioning is not fit to be considered. In their cultural context, it's closer to an insult than a refusal. The silence in the room was substantial. So I can't reject it without insulting her, Vale said. Not without very careful diplomatic language that we don't yet have good frameworks for. I can't accept it because that has political implications. Significant ones. And doing nothing is also something. Also significant. Yes. Vale looked at Suresh. She returned his look with the expression of someone who was genuinely, deeply sorry for him while also understanding that there was nothing she could do. The mission was, he said slowly, to recover or render assistance to vessels in distress. Yes. I rendered assistance to a vessel in distress. You did. And somehow, he stopped again. Then, in a tone that was not dramatic but simply accurate, what do you need from me? Osei, for the first time in the meeting, looked something other than professionally neutral. He looked briefly relieved. I need you to do something that very few engineers are good at, he said. I need you to not do anything. Not yet. I need time to consult with colleagues who have spent careers studying Vakarath civil law, and I need to craft a response that navigates this with the care it deserves. And I need, he paused. I need you to be willing to engage in this process. Engage in what process? In the process of responding to an alien civilization's highest-order civil petition in a way that maintains the dignity of both parties and does not precipitate a diplomatic rupture between humanity and the most powerful collective we've encountered. The antiseptic smell of the conference room was very present in the subsequent silence. Vale picked up his coffee cup, found it empty and set it back down. He looked at Osei. You'll need to explain it to me, he said. All of it. I'm an engineer. I understand systems. Explain this system to me and I'll understand what needs to be done. Osei looked at him for a moment and something shifted in his expression. Something that was professional respect, arriving perhaps a little unexpectedly. All right, he said. Let's start from the beginning. The 3 days that followed would later be described in the academic literature on Vakarath human relations as the geometry phase of the first contact sequence. A period of careful maneuvering in which both sides were simultaneously trying to understand each other and trying not to break anything. Osei worked with an intensity that Suresh found both impressive and slightly alarming. He was in constant encrypted communication with Earth Coordination's Xenodiplomacy Division, with 3 separate universities that had researchers specializing in Vakarath cultural studies, and with the Vakarath court itself, through a formal communication channel that the Luminous Persistence had opened shortly after Osei's arrival, a channel that used the translation matrix both ships had, which was better than nothing and worse than anyone would have liked. The translation problem was serious. Not in the technical sense, the matrix could convert vocabulary adequately. In the deeper sense, language carries culture. The words that exist in a language reveal what that culture has decided is worth naming. The Vakarath had extraordinarily precise vocabulary for concepts related to repair, care, and formal relationship, and almost no vocabulary for what humans might call coincidence or unintended consequence. The concept of doing something meaningful without meaning to was, apparently, nearly absent from their linguistic tradition. This was the center of the problem. Vale, to his considerable credit, had spent the 3 days doing exactly what Osei asked. Reading everything the Xenodiplomacy team sent him about Vakarath civil law, asking precise questions, and not communicating directly with the Luminous Persistence. He had also, characteristically, continued his analysis of the hull material sample. He made a note in his formal report that the biological polymer threading showed evidence of adaptive response to mechanical stress. It had, in the 48 hours since the repair, partially reoriented its fiber structure in the area around the junction, adding mechanical support to his repair. The ship's material had helped heal itself, working with what he'd done rather than against it. He mentioned this to Osei in passing. Osei stopped and looked at him for a very long time. "Say that again." Vale explained it. "The adaptive response. The material's behavior around the repair site." Osei was quiet for a full minute. Then he turned to his communication console and began composing a message to his cultural studies contacts with a speed that suggested this mattered in a way Vale hadn't anticipated. The answer came back in 6 hours. One of the researchers, a woman named Dr. Lena Hoffman who had spent 4 years studying Vakarath biological architecture, replied with a message that Osei read twice and then summarized for Vale. "The ship," Osei said carefully, "is partially biological. The polymer threading is alive in a limited sense. It responds to structural stress. It also, and this is where it gets complicated, it also responds to what the Vakarath describe as intentional engagement. The material reads intention through touch. Specifically, the steadiness, patience, and purpose with which something is handled." Vale said nothing. "The material around your repair site didn't just stabilize structurally," Osei continued. "It integrated. The Vakarath engineers aboard the Luminous Persistence have been monitoring it. The hull material has incorporated your repair into itself. In Vakarath understanding of their own ships, that means the ship has..." He paused, reading from his screen. "The phrase used is, recognize the care as genuine." The silence was long. "Their ships are partially sentient," Vale said slowly. "Sentient is probably too strong a word. Responsive is better. They are built to respond to quality of intention as well as quality of technique. And their ship responded to mine." "Yes." Vale processed this. "That's going to matter to them." "It already does," Osei said. "I've been trying to understand why the court's response was so immediate and unambiguous. I think this is part of why. The ship itself in their framework weighed in. The diplomatic geometry of the situation was becoming clearer, and it was more intricate than anyone had initially appreciated. What had looked, from the outside, like a cultural miscommunication was emerging as something else. A first-contact interaction in which the human actor had, entirely by accident, done almost everything right. Not because he understood the Vakarath. Because he had approached the problem with a quality of attention and care that transcended the specifics of cultural context. The question of response remained. Osei's team had developed 3 possible communication frameworks. He presented them to Vale in the conference room with careful precision. The first was a formal diplomatic acknowledgement from Earth Coordination, transmitted through official channels, that neither accepted nor rejected the court's finding but registered it as a matter for future intergovernmental discussion. Clean, professional, safe. The problem: in Vakarath court protocol, a petition of this class could not be delegated to institutional response. It had been filed by an individual. It required individual response. A government statement would be legally read as an evasion, the equivalent of refusing to engage. The second was a formal rejection, carefully worded, with the specific language Osei's team had developed to minimize the diplomatic insult. Technically possible. Diplomatically costly. The court's formal record would contain a rejection, and every subsequent interaction between humanity and the collective would be colored by that record. The third was the one Osei presented last and presented carefully. It involved Vale composing a personal communication to the court, not to Etherevel directly, which protocol prevented, but to the court as a formal body. The communication would acknowledge the court's finding, acknowledge the actions that led to it, and request, in language that the Vakarath legal tradition recognized as valid, a period of formal inquiry. A period during which the petitioning party formally expressed willingness to understand before acting. In human terms, it was something like, "I take this seriously. I need time to understand what I'm being asked. Please allow me that time." In Vakarath law, this was a recognized intermediate state. It was not evasion. It was due diligence. It had precedent. It would, per Osei's researchers, be read as evidence of sincerity rather than uncertainty. "It buys time," Suresh said. "It does more than that," Osei said. "It establishes a relationship." The act of asking for time to understand is itself, in their framework, an act of respect. It says, "This matters enough to understand properly." Vale had read all three frameworks. He sat with them for a moment. "The first option treats this as a government problem," he said. "Yes. It isn't a government problem. It happened because I fixed a ship." "Yes. The second option," he paused. "The second option hurts someone who didn't do anything wrong." She responded to what happened honestly under her own law. "Rejecting it formally puts a mark on her record in that court, doesn't it?" Osei's expression shifted slightly. "You've been reading carefully." "I said I would." "Yes." "A formal rejection carries a reciprocal notation in the court record that the petition was, there's no clean translation. The phrase is close to found insufficient. It attaches to the petitioner's record." "Which is her record," Vale said. "Because the petition party's response is recorded against the one who acknowledged the petition." "That's correct. So if I formally reject it, she carries a notation saying she acknowledged an insufficient petition." "In simplified terms, yes." Vale looked at the third framework on his screen. He read it again. Then he looked at Osei. "Write it," he said. "Option 3. I'll review it and sign it." "It commits you to a process," Osei said. "I want to be clear about that. It's not a way out. It's a way forward." "I know what I'm doing," Vale said. And Osei, who had spent 20 years in xenodiplomacy and had a very precise sense of when people knew what they were doing and when they didn't, believed him. The formal communication was transmitted on the 17th day after the repair. It had taken that long because precision mattered and because Osei's team, working with 3 xenocultural researchers, 2 linguists and a legal theorist who specialized in non-human civil frameworks, had produced 11 drafts before arriving at one they believed was correct. Not just accurate but appropriate. Not just polite but honest. The final version was approximately 400 words in English, translated into a Vakarath formal register that the team assessed as appropriate to court communication. It acknowledged the repair and the conditions under which it was made. It acknowledged that the actions, whatever their intent in the actor's own cultural framework, had occurred within Vakarath jurisdiction and that Vakarath legal interpretation of those actions had weight and validity. It acknowledged the court's finding without contesting it. It then made the formal request for an inquiry period, using the specific Vakarath legal term, velsheri, which the translation matrix rendered as something between honest investigation and time given in good faith. The final paragraph was Vale's. Osei had written a diplomatic version, and Vale had read it and then written his own, and after some discussion Osei had agreed that Vale's version was better. It was direct in a way that the diplomatic version wasn't. It said in substance, "I don't know enough about you to respond properly. I want to know more. I am asking for the time to learn because what was done should be answered honestly, not quickly." The transmission was sent. The ardent resolve and the luminous persistence had been joined, at some point during the prior week, by 2 additional human vessels, an Earth coordination observer ship and a signals intelligence platform that was being very quiet about what it was, and by a Vakarath escort carrier that had arrived without announcement and positioned itself at a respectful but unambiguous distance. Neutral space had become something more structured. The response from the court arrived in 9 hours. This was, per the researchers, itself significant. 9 hours was fast for a formal court response. Standard Vakarath court deliberation for velsheri requests ran between 3 days and 3 weeks. The response was formal in structure and brief in content. It acknowledged receipt of the communication. It noted that the translation quality was assessed as adequate and the register as appropriate. It noted, with a specificity that the linguists found remarkable, that the communication had been identified as containing two distinct voices, one diplomatic, one individual, and that the court had weighed both. It accepted the Velsheri request. And then it contained a paragraph that produced, in the Xenodiplomacy team, a silence that lasted approximately 4 minutes before anyone spoke. The paragraph described, in formal Vakarath legal language, the court's assessment of the petitioner. This was standard in Velsheri acceptance, a formal characterization that established the basis on which the inquiry period was granted. Usually it was procedural language, competence confirmed, petition recorded, proceeding authorized. What the court had written was not procedural. Osei read it 3 times and then called Dr. Hoffman, who read it and was quiet for a long time. "Is this standard language?" he asked. "No," she said. This is characterization language. This is the court telling you something about how they see him." She walked him through it. The Vakarath formal register had specific grammatical constructions for levels of regard. Not emotional language, but structural language. The way a sentence was built indicated the weight given to its subject. The paragraph about Vale was constructed in a register that Hoffman had seen, in her 4 years of studying Vakarath court documents, exactly twice before. Both times, it had been used to characterize individuals of historical significance to the collective. The substance of the paragraph, translated as carefully as they could manage, said something like this. The petitioner acted without instruction in a space of ambiguity, and chose restoration over calculation. The court has reviewed the record of his work and finds evidence of quality that is not contingent on recognition. He documented his actions for those who would come after him, not for those watching in the present. This court considers such quality to be without common equivalent. Hoffman's voice over the encrypted channel was careful and precise. They're telling you that they see him. Not as a representative of your species. Not as a diplomatic incident. As a specific person. And that what they see is, she paused. The word I keep coming back to is rare. Osei sat with this. In the ship's engineering section, Vale was unaware of the content of the court's response. Osei had not yet told him. He was, at the moment the response arrived, writing a supplemental technical note on the biological polymer's adaptive behavior, which he was preparing to submit to a materials science journal through the Earth Coordination academic channel. He had already corresponded briefly, through the observer ship's communication relay, with 2 researchers at the Institute of Xenomaterials at Nairobi University who were extremely interested in his sample data. He was not thinking about diplomacy. He was thinking about the material. Suresh found him there. She had a particular expression, not alarmed, not happy exactly, but moved in some way she was still processing. The court responded, she said. Osei told me they accepted the Velsheri. He told you the procedural result. He didn't tell you what they wrote about you. She showed him her own copy of the translation. You read it? She watched him read it. He reached the final paragraph and read it twice more, and his expression did the thing that expressions do when someone encounters something they don't know how to hold. A brief, involuntary opening before the composure reasserts itself. He set the tablet down. That's more than I did, he said. Is it? Suresh asked. He didn't answer that. He picked up the tablet again and read the last paragraph once more. Then he set it down and was quiet for a moment. What does the Velsheri period involve? He asked. Specifically. Osei will walk you through it. Give me the short version. She sat in the chair across from him. Formal exchange of cultural documentation. A series of facilitated communications, not personal, court-mediated, in which both parties can ask questions through appropriate channels. It's designed to build enough shared understanding that whatever decision gets made at the end is an informed one. How long? Standard is 90 days. The court has proposed 60. Vale noted this. They're moving faster than standard. Yes. Why? Suresh looked at him. Osei's interpretation is that they find the situation, compelling enough not to want to wait the standard period. Hoffman's interpretation is slightly different. She paused. She thinks Vale is curious. Vale absorbed this. I'm going to need to learn more about their culture, he said. Properly. Not just the legal framework. Osei has materials. And their engineering tradition. If I'm going to understand them, I want to understand how they build things. What they build. Why they build it the way they do. He looked at the material sample still on his workbench. I think you understand something about a culture when you understand how it interacts with the physical world. Suresh was quiet for a moment. Marcus, she said. Do you know what you're doing? Not tactically. Actually. He looked at her. He thought about the sensor image he'd seen once. A long curved ship drifting in neutral space, venting atmosphere. The specific quality of a problem presenting itself. The absence, in that moment, of any consideration beyond. This can be fixed. I can fix it. No, he said honestly. But I know why I'm doing it. Why? Because the ship needed fixing, he said. And now something else needs fixing. And I'm apparently the one who showed up. 60 days. It was, in the scope of what it accomplished, one of the most compressed diplomatic processes in the history of either civilization. The Vakkarath court's cultural exchange documentation ran to thousands of pages, detailed, precise, and organized with a systematic thoroughness that the xenodiplomacy team found both overwhelming and deeply familiar in its underlying logic. The humans produced comparable documentation, curated from decades of cultural archive. Vale read everything they said. He read it the way he read technical manuals, methodically, annotating as he went, building a working model in his head that he periodically tested by asking questions through the formal channel. His questions were noticed. Hoffman, reviewing the exchange transcripts, told Osei that in 15 years of studying Vakkarath court communications she had never seen a non-Vakkarath party receive so many unsolicited elaborations in response to questions. Standard court protocol answered questions at the minimum necessary length. The responses to Vale's questions were consistently longer, more detailed, often containing observations that he hadn't asked for but that, consistently, turned out to be relevant to the questions he was going to ask next. They're anticipating him, she said. The court is anticipating his questions? Someone in that court is, she said. Someone who is reading his questions very carefully. On the 43rd day, an event occurred that Osei described in his formal report as outside the established procedural framework, and that Hoffman described in a private message to a colleague as the most remarkable thing I've witnessed in this field. A personal message arrived for Vale. Not through the formal court channel. Through a secondary frequency, the same frequency that the distress signal had originally been broadcast on. The message was brief. It was not in Vakkarath formal register. It was in a simpler, more direct register that the translation matrix identified as conversational. It said, "You asked why our ships are built with living material. The answer is that we believe a thing built without intention is always less than a thing built with it. You understood this before you were told." Oh. Vale sat with this for a long time. He wrote 4 drafts of his response. Then he deleted all 4 and wrote what he actually thought. I don't know that I understand it. I know that when I'm repairing something, there's a quality of attention that either happens or doesn't. When it happens, the work is better. When it doesn't, the repair holds technically but something's off. I always assumed that was something in me. The idea that the material itself could respond to it, that's new to me. But it doesn't surprise me. Materials are just physics with a history. I think everything has a history. He sent it through the secondary frequency. The response came in 2 hours. We have a word for what you describe. The closest your language gets is careful witness. We consider it the most important quality in an engineer. He looked at that for a long time. What do you call it in yours? He transmitted. The response? We call it the same thing we call what you did for this ship. In our language there is only one word. On the 58th day, 2 days before the Velsheri period's formal conclusion, Osei called Vale into the conference room. The antiseptic smell was still there. The recording device was on the table. The court has transmitted the formal end of inquiry protocol, Osei said. At the conclusion of the Velsheri period, both parties are required to declare their position. In Vakkarath law this is called the ashen, the naming. Both parties name what the relationship is or what it is not. Vale knew this. He had read the documentation. The court has asked a question, Osei said. Addressed to you. Personally. He turned his tablet around. The question in the formal court register was translated as, the petitioner has been witnessed across 60 days of inquiry. The court asks, does the petitioner understand now what he asked? Vale read it. He read it again. It's asking if I understand what I did, he said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Not what I intended to do. What I did. That distinction is important to them. I know, he said. He sat with the question for a long moment. Then he asked for paper, actual paper from the supply cabinet, and a pen. Osei, who had not been asked for paper in a professional context in 11 years, produced both without comment. Vale wrote for approximately 20 minutes. He wrote, crossed out, rewrote. The pen moved in the careful, deliberate way his hands always moved when he was working precisely. He handed Osei a handwritten page. Osei read it. He read it twice. He looked up. "This is your formal response," he said. "For the record, for the court record and for Earth Coordination's record, you're certain?" "Yes." Osei typed it into the transmission console, translating as he typed, the Xenodiplomacy translation engine converting Vale's words into the formal Vakarath court register. He read the translation back to Vale. The substance of Vale's response was this. "I am an engineer. When I approached this vessel, I saw a system in failure. I acted because that is what I do, not from calculation but from the same quality of attention I try to bring to every repair. What I did not know was that the material of this ship was built to receive exactly that quality of attention, and that the law of the people who built it was built on the same principle, that what you do with care and intention is what you genuinely mean, regardless of the words you attach to it. I understand now what I asked because I understand now that I asked it in the only language I know how to speak fluently, the language of repair, of making things whole, of staying until the system is stable. I asked it honestly though not knowingly. I believe honesty without knowledge is not a sufficient foundation, but I also believe it is a beginning. If the court accepts this as a beginning, I am willing to continue." The transmission went. The response from the court arrived in 6 hours. This time it was not brief. The formal declaration ran to several pages in Vakarath legal text. Osei and Hoffman worked through it together. Hoffman cried once briefly while reading the middle section, and when Osei looked at her she shook her head and said, It's very good law. Some things are just very good law." The substance was this. The court accepted Vale's declaration. It accepted the framing of beginning with a formal notation that the Vakarath legal term for this, there was one, precise and specific, meant something closer to the first structure of a thing that will take time to build correctly. It noted that both parties had, across 60 days, demonstrated what the court characterized as compatible approaches to understanding. It noted, with the particular kind of gravity that formal court documents reserve for things that will be cited later, that this was the first Vakarath court proceeding in which a non-Vakarath party had been assessed as operating in good faith from the first recorded action. It then formally registered the relationship between Vale and the Queen-designate Etherivel as Velinara, a term that Hoffman translated, carefully, as acknowledged beginning between parties of recognized quality. Not a union. Not a formal partnership. Not a diplomatic alliance. A beginning. The final section of the document was addressed not to Vale but to Earth Coordination. It registered, formally, the Vakarath Court's interest in opening a permanent diplomatic channel. The specific language used framed this interest as arising from the events of the prior 62 days, from the action in neutral space and the inquiry that followed. It stated, with the precision of a civilization that had been watching humanity for years from a careful distance and had not, until now, found a sufficient reason to move closer. "We have observed what your people do in moments of crisis. We have observed what this individual did. We find these consistent. We find consistency to be a foundation." Osei read that paragraph to the assembled crew of the Ardent Resolve in the main gathering space. The crew was quiet while he read. The silence after was the kind that comes when people feel something large happening around them and are still finding their footing in it. Vale was standing at the back of the room. He looked, by all accounts, essentially the same as he always looked. Not particularly moved, not particularly dramatic. When Suresh found him afterward, he was in the engineering section, writing the final technical report on the hull material sample. "The diplomatic channel opens in 6 months, she said. Earth Coordination is already mobilizing a full first contact team. Osei says you'll be asked to participate in the initial sessions." "All right," he said. He also said, she paused, choosing words. "He said that what you did here, the way you handled all of it, is going to be studied. As a model. He said most people, faced with what you were facing, would have calculated. I wasn't calculating. He knows. That's the point." Vale set his pen down. He looked at the material sample in its containment case. A small piece of hull from a ship whose people had built the ability to recognize care directly into their architecture. "She asked me how I knew about intention before being told," he said. "In that message. I remember. I didn't answer it fully." He picked up the containment case and turned it in the light. "The truth is, I didn't know. I still don't really in any formal sense. I just know that when you're working on something that matters, there's a right way to do it. Not right in the sense of protocol. Right in the sense of," he paused, "worthy of the thing itself." Suresh looked at him. Outside the viewport, the luminous persistence was still visible, long, curved, alive in ways both of them were only beginning to understand. Fully stable. running on a repair that had been incorporated into its own living material. Do you think this is going to work? She asked. All of it. The channel, the relationship, what comes next. He thought about it honestly. I think it'll break down and need fixing, he said. More than once. These things always do. He set the containment case down. But I know how to fix things. She smiled. In the formal court record of the luminous persistence, the proceedings of the prior 62 days were archived under a title that translated, imperfectly but meaningfully, as, "The case of the one who repaired what was broken and did not leave until it was whole." It would be cited, in Vakarath legal scholarship and in human xenodiplomacy studies, for the next 200 years. The beginning of something that would take time to build correctly had been recorded. Witnessed. Name. It was, as beginnings go, sufficient.